November 12, 1878. A wind that carried the iron scent of coming snow scoured the high slopes of the Colorado mountains, rattling the last stubborn leaves on the aspen trees. Adeline Rowe stood before the dark mouth of the cave, her hand resting on the rough fur between her dog's shoulders. The animal, a shepherd named Kaiser, stood rigid, a low growl a mere vibration in his chest. In Adeline's palm, the single, cold iron key felt heavier than the $400 she had paid for it, for this place, for this last chance. The paper deed, tucked inside her worn coat, felt as fragile as a dead leaf. A cabin, the land agent had called it. It was more of a linter, a wooden face hammered into a wound in the rock, a desperate man's idea of a house. But it was hers. The thought brought no joy, only a dull, final thud of acceptance. What nobody knew, what the smirking land agent could not have guessed, was that for Adeline, a house built into a shadow was not a downgrade. It was a mirror. She had been living in a cave of another kind for the last 6 months, a hollowed-out space carved by grief and the polite, unyielding cruelty of family. She remembered her mother-in-law, Martha Proctor, standing on the porch of the farmhouse Adeline had shared with Thomas, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "It is what Thomas would have wanted," she had said, her voice smooth as river stone. The farm stays in the Proctor line therefore. Adeline, not of the Proctor line, was out. One suitcase, her husband's dog, and a small, bitter sum of money meant to salve a conscience, not secure a future. Adeline looked from the key to the dark door. The wood was silvered with age and weather. A life ends, another must begin. That is the harsh and simple arithmetic of the world. She inserted the key. The lock protested with a screech of rust, a sound of long disuse, before finally turning over with a heavy clunk. The door swung inward on one groaning hinge, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of damp stone, mouse leavings, and the deep, patient earth. Kaiser whined, pressing against her leg, but Adeline nudged him gently forward. "It is our home now," she whispered, the words tasting strange in her mouth. They stepped across the threshold, from the grey light of dusk into a deeper gloom. The cabin portion was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square. A thick layer of dust and grime coated everything, the crude plank floor, the small stone hearth, the single window opaque with filth. A broken chair lay on its side like a fallen man, and a rusted bucket sat beneath a dark stain on the ceiling where the roof had leaked. But the structure, what she could see of it, was sound. The timbers were thick, the joinery at the corners tight. It was a place built to endure, not to charm. Behind the wooden room, the cave yawned. It was not a shallow alcove, it was a true cavern, a throat of blackness leading down into the mountain. Adeline held up the lantern she'd carried from the wagon, its flickering light pushing back the shadows only a few feet, revealing walls that glistened with moisture and a floor that sloped away into nothing. Kaiser refused to look at it, keeping his body firmly in the wooden part of the dwelling, his eyes fixed on Adeline's face. She felt a tremor of the dog's fear in her own bones. This was a wild place, a place on the edge of the map, and she was a woman alone. The $400 had been nearly all of it. What was left would not last the winter. But desperation was its own kind of fuel. She set the lantern on the floor, unlatched the single, battered suitcase, and took out the only 2 items of value she had left in the world. One was a thick wool blanket, woven by her own mother. The other was a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages still mostly empty. She opened it, and on the first page, with a stub of a pencil, she wrote the date. Then, beneath it, 2 words, Day 1. The first week was a battle fought with broom and bucket, with rags and rage. Adeline worked from the first thin light of dawn until her body ached too much to move, a frantic energy born of the cold seeping through the floorboards. She swept out years of accumulated dust and debris, her efforts raising a choking cloud that filled the small space. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, the lye soap biting into the skin of her already calloused palms, turning the water in the bucket a thick, satisfying black. The work was a kind of prayer, a physical manifestation of her will to not just survive, but to inhabit this place, to make it hers. She found the source of the leak, a patch of shoddy shingling, and climbed onto the roof with a hammer and a handful of nails she'd salvaged from the broken chair. The wind tore at her skirts, trying to push her from the precarious perch, but she held on, her jaw set, hammering until her arm was numb. Every nail driven home was a small victory against the encroaching wilderness, against the memory of Martha Proctor's placid, dismissive face. At night, she and Kaiser would huddle together under the wool blanket, the dog's solid warmth a comfort against the profound, listening silence of the mountain. The fire in the newly cleaned hearth was small, fed by the wood she could gather nearby, but it was a living heart in the stone-cold darkness. She would eat her meager meal of hard bread and dried meat, then open the ledger. Each evening, she made an entry. Fixed the roof. Found a spring, water is clear. Gathered 2 armloads of wood. Kaiser flashed a grouse. The entries were a testament, a record of existence. They were proof that she was still here. A storm blew in on the 7th day, a premature taste of the winter to come. It was not snow, but a driving, freezing rain that turned the world to a grey smear. The wind howled around the cabin, shrieking like a lost soul, and the rain hammered against her patched roof. Adeline sat by the fire, listening, every muscle tense. She watched the spot where the leak had been, waiting for the telltale drip. An hour passed, then 2. The ceiling remained dry. A slow, unfamiliar feeling uncoiled in her chest. It was not joy, not yet. It was something quieter, harder. It was the feeling of a single, solid nail holding fast against a storm. The storm passed, but the cold remained, a permanent guest at her hearth. Adeline took stock of her supplies. The flour was low, the salt nearly gone, the coffee a precious few beans she rationed with miserly care. The world outside her cave was a necessity she had hoped to avoid, but survival demanded it. The land agent had mentioned a settlement, a cluster of cabins in the valley called Gant's Folly, a place spoken of with a shrug, as if it were barely worth naming. It was a 5-mile walk, a journey she did not relish, but one she could not afford to postpone. She left Kaiser to guard the cabin, his mournful howl following her down the trail, a sound that snagged at her heart. Gant's Folly was little more than a trading post and a handful of rough-hewn cabins clinging to the bank of a creek. Smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys, but the place felt half asleep, hunkered down for winter. The trading post was a long, low building smelling of sawdust, tobacco, and tanned hides. A few men in worn coats stood around a pot-bellied stove, their conversation halting as she entered. They appraised her with the slow, neutral curiosity of the deeply isolated, their eyes taking in her worn dress, her determined chin, her lack of a male escort. Adeline ignored them, her focus on the shelves stocked with the necessity she craved. She was measuring out a small bag of flour when an old man detached himself from the shadows near the back. He was bent and weathered, his face a roadmap of hard seasons, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He moved with a stiff, deliberate slowness, but there was nothing feeble about him. He stopped not beside her, but beside a display of traps, his gnarled hand running over the cold steel. "That clay up on your ridge," he said, his voice a dry rustle, not looking at her. "The red kind. Mix it with ash from your fire. Makes a mortar that'll hold till Judgment Day." Adeline froze, her hand tightening on the flour sack. She hadn't said where she was living. But the men at the stove had fallen silent, watching. They knew. Of course they knew. She was the woman who bought the cave. "Thank you," she said, her own voice quiet, but clear. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Chimney draws better when it's sealed tight. He picked up a fox trap, paid the proprietor in coin, and left without another word. His name, she would later learn, was Zebulon. He had not offered pity or charity. He had offered information, a currency more valuable than gold. He had seen her, not as a fool or a victim, but as a fellow creature trying to survive the winter. Adeline walked the 5 miles back up the mountain, her pack heavier with flour and salt, but her spirit lighter. Zebulon's words were a gift. He had not asked her story, had not offered platitudes. He had simply seen a problem and offered a solution, the practical language of the frontier. It was an acknowledgement of her effort, a sign that she was not just a curiosity, but a neighbor, however distant. The next morning, she was up at dawn, digging the rich, red clay from the bank behind the cabin. It was cold and heavy in her hands. She mixed it with the grey ash from her hearth, the texture turning thick and smooth, like a baker's dough. Following the old man's implicit instructions, she set about remortaring the stones of her fireplace, both inside the cabin and on the roof. It was messy, painstaking work. She pushed the mixture into every crack and crevice, smoothing it with her fingers until the stones were sealed tight against the wind. Her hands were caked in the stuff, her face smeared with it, but as she worked, a rhythm took hold. Dig, mix, apply. It was the same rhythm of survival she had been practicing for weeks. That night, the difference was astounding. The fire drew clean and hot, throwing a steady, generous heat into the room. The drafts that had snaked along the floor were gone. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home, a sealed and solid space carved out of the wilderness. She had done this. With her own 2 hands, and a stranger's quiet advice, she had made her world warmer, safer. But as the cabin grew more secure, the cave behind it seemed to grow more menacing. It was a constant presence at her back, a mouth of cold air and deep, unnerving silence. Kaiser would not go near it. If a piece of wood rolled from the fire and into the mouth of the cave, the dog would stand at the edge of the wooden floor, whining, until Adeline retrieved it for him. She had pushed a heavy, flat-top boulder in front of the deeper passage, less a door than a statement of intent. This far, and no farther. Yet, the mystery of it was a weight in the quiet hours. The air that breathed from it was different, ancient, and still. And sometimes, when the wind died down and the world went utterly silent, she could almost imagine a sound from its depths, a whisper so faint it was likely just the blood beating in her own ears. The dread was a low hum beneath the surface of her daily labor, a constant reminder that she was living on the edge of a place she did not understand. The first true blizzard of the season arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull pewter, the next, the world dissolved into a churning, blinding whiteness. The wind, no longer howling, settled into a single, monolithic roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Adeline had been caught out gathering firewood, and she stumbled back to the cabin just as the storm closed in, her coat and hair instantly caked with a thick layer of snow. She slammed the door shut, the sound swallowed by the gale, and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The small, dirty window was a square of roiling white. They were trapped. For 2 days, the storm raged. The world shrank to the dimensions of the small cabin. Time became meaningless, measured only by the logs she fed to the fire and the level of coffee left in her tin. Outside, the snow piled up, burying the cabin, sealing them in. The light coming through the window grew dimmer and dimmer, a pale, submarine glow. By the 3rd day, a strange and profound silence fell. The wind had died. But the silence was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. The snow had drifted up over the roof, burying them completely. Adeline tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like pushing against the mountain itself. A spike of pure, cold panic shot through her, the first she had allowed herself to feel. She was in a box, buried alive. Kaiser, sensing her fear, paced restlessly. His usual calm was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. He whined, his nose pressed to the crack under the door, then turned and looked toward the cave. Suddenly, he began to bark, not his usual warning growl, but a frantic, insistent sound. He ran to the large boulder she had placed in front of the cave's deeper passage and began scratching at it, looking back at her, his eyes wild. "Kaiser, stop," she commanded, but he ignored her. He was stronger than she was, and in his agitation, he pushed and dug and scrambled at the rock. With a great grating sound, the boulder shifted, scraping across the stone floor, opening the dark passage she had so carefully blocked. Before she could react, Kaiser bolted into the blackness, his barks echoing and receding into the depths of the mountain. Adeline's panic was instantly replaced by a new, sharper fear. The fear of losing the one living thing she had left. "Kaiser," she screamed, her voice sounding small and thin. The only answer was the faint, distant echo of his barking. There was no choice. Grabbing her lantern and a coil of rope, she plunged into the cold, waiting dark. The air in the cave was shockingly cold, a dead, still cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. It was the ancient cold of the deep earth. Her lantern cast a small, trembling circle of light, pushing back a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical substance. The walls of the passage were narrow and slick with moisture, forcing her to turn sideways in places. The sound of Kaiser's barking was her only guide, a frantic, echoing beacon pulling her deeper into the mountain's gut. The passage twisted and turned, sloping steadily downward. The floor was uneven, littered with loose stones that threatened to turn an ankle. Adeline moved slowly, one hand on the damp rock wall, the other holding the lantern high. She called for Kaiser again and again, her voice swallowed by the immense silence between his barks. She had no idea how far she had gone. 5 minutes, 10? Time behaved differently down here. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What if he was hurt? What if he had fallen? What if she became lost? The thought was a chilling one. She uncoiled a length of rope, tied one end to a rock outcropping near the entrance of the passage, and paid it out as she went, a lifeline back to the world. The barking grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from a place off to her right. She saw it then, a narrow fissure in the rock wall she would have missed entirely, partially obscured by a rockfall. The barking was coming from inside. She squeezed through the opening and found herself in a different kind of space. It was not a passage, but a chamber, small and surprisingly dry, no more than 10 feet across. The air here was still and stale, but not damp. And in the center of the chamber, his paws and muzzle covered in dirt, was Kaiser. He was digging frantically at the ground, a pile of loose rock and dry earth pushed behind him. He stopped when he saw her, whined once, then gave a sharp bark as if to say, "Here, look here." Adeline knelt beside him, the lantern light dancing over the disturbed ground. She saw what he had been digging at, a corner of oilcloth, dark and stiff, sticking out from beneath a large, flat stone. Her heart hammered in her chest. She set the lantern down carefully, its steady glow illuminating the small, secret room. Together, she and the dog worked to free the object. She used her bare hands, her fingers quickly growing numb, to pull away the smaller rocks while Kaiser dug at the earth. Finally, they cleared enough space for her to get a grip on the large, flat stone. She braced her feet, put her back into it, and heaved. The stone scraped, resisted, then tilted and fell away, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Nestled inside, wrapped in the oilcloth, was a canvas sack, rotten with age and damp. With trembling fingers, Adeline reached into the shallow hole and lifted the canvas sack. It was heavier than it looked, and the fabric was so decayed that it began to disintegrate in her hands. The smell of dust and time and something faintly metallic rose from it. She carried it back to the lantern and knelt, carefully unrolling the rotting oilcloth. Kaiser sat beside her, his head cocked, the frantic energy gone now that his work was done. He watched her, his breathing a soft pant in the profound silence of the chamber. The first thing she saw was a tarnish that was almost black, but with a recognizable shape. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped, its surface etched with a delicate floral pattern. She pried it open with her thumbnail. On one side was a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with serious eyes and hair piled high on her head. On the other, a tiny, perfectly preserved lock of blonde hair, tied with a thread. Her fingers brushed against something else, a bundle wrapped in twine. She lifted it out. It was a packet of letters, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown. The handwriting was small and neat, a scholar's hand. Beneath the letters lay the heaviest object. It was a bronze medal, shaped like a star, hanging from a faded blue ribbon. Even in the dim light, she could make out the word Valor inscribed above the image of a goddess. It was a military decoration, a medal from the war that had torn the country apart more than a decade ago. This was not a bandit's hoard. There was no gold, no currency, no treasure. This was a life. A life distilled down to its most precious elements, a symbol of love, a testament of words, and proof of honor. Someone had hidden these things, carefully and deliberately, as if intending to come back for them. A man, she presumed. A soldier. She sat back on her heels, the cold of the stone floor seeping into her bones. The blizzard, the buried cabin, her own fear, it all seemed to fade into the background. She was no longer just a widow in a cave. She was the keeper of a secret, the inheritor of a story left to moulder in the dark. The man who had lived here before her was not a ghost to be feared, but a presence to be understood. The cave was not empty. It was waiting. Trapped by the snow, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but feed the fire and wait, Adeline read the letters. She untied the brittle twine with care and opened the first one, her hands gentle as if handling a sleeping bird. The letters were all addressed to my dearest Anna, the woman in the locket. They were written by a man named Corporal Amos Weaver. The first few letters were from the battlefield, full of the mundane details of a soldier's life, shot through with a longing for home so sharp it felt like a physical pain. He wrote of the cold, the mud, the poor food, and his unshakable love for her. Then, the tone of the letters changed. There was a new, desperate edge to the writing. He wrote of an officer, a Captain Sterling, a man of wealth and influence who was cruel and corrupt, selling company supplies on the black market. Amos, it seemed, had witnessed it. He had been threatened. He looks at me with a deadness in his eyes, Anna, he wrote. He knows that I know. I fear what he might do. The last letter was almost illegible, scrawled in haste from a hiding place near the front. Captain Sterling had been robbed of the company payroll. Amos, the only man who knew of the captain's other crimes, was named the prime suspect. A warrant was issued for his arrest, for desertion and theft. It is a lie, all of it, he wrote, the words a desperate slash of ink across the page. He has framed me to silence me. They will hang me if they catch me. I am running. I will come back for you when I can, when I have cleared my name. Do not believe what they say of me. I am your Amos. Always. There were no more letters. Adeline sat in the quiet of the buried cabin, the silent, white world pressing in on all sides, and felt a profound and startling kinship with the ghost of Amos Weaver. He was an outcast, just as she was. He had been judged, condemned, and cast out by those in power, his name tarnished by lies. She looked at her own hands, chapped and raw from her labor, and thought of his hands, writing these letters, hiding his honor in a hole in the ground. Her own exile, which had felt so personal and so bitter, now seemed part of a larger, older story. The mountain was not just a place of survival, it was a sanctuary for the dispossessed. She was not the first to find refuge in its stony embrace. Her solitude was not a punishment. It was a legacy. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. For days, the only sound was the drip, drip, drip of melting snow. Then one morning, a sliver of true sunlight pierced the grimy window, and Adeline, pushing against the door with all her might, felt it give way with a great sucking sound. She stumbled out into a world reborn. The snow was gone from the cabin, though it still lay thick in the shadows, and the air was soft with the smell of damp earth and pine. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. Some days later, a figure appeared on the trail below, moving with a familiar, stiff-legged gait. It was Zebulon. He carried a brace of rabbits in one hand and a small sack in the other. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, his pale eyes taking in the scene, the smoke rising from the chimney, the neatly stacked firewood, Adeline herself, standing straight and calm on her doorstep. He'd come checking, she realized, expecting to find a snow-filled ruin and a grim task. He nodded, a gesture that contained a world of unspoken acknowledgement. Heard the storm was a bad one, he said, his voice as dry as ever. It was, Adeline replied. I have coffee on. She did not invite him in. He would not have come. But he did sit on a log near the entrance to the cave while she brought him a steaming mug. He accepted it with another nod. For a long time, they sat in silence, drinking the hot, bitter coffee, two solitary creatures sharing a patch of sunlight. Finally, Adeline spoke. The man who built this place, she said, her voice steady. I found something of his. She told him the story, not of her own discovery, but of Amos Weaver's. She told him about the letters, the locket, the medal. She did not show them to him, but he did not need to see them. He listened, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks, his face unreadable. When she finished, the silence returned, deeper this time. Zebulon drained his cup and set it down carefully on the log. "Sterling," he said, the name a flat, hard stone in the quiet air. "Heard of him. Bought up half the valley after the war. Big man. Built a big house. Died in it last year. Rich and respected." The irony was as bitter as the dregs in his coffee cup. Amos Weaver had died a fugitive in a cave, his name a synonym for coward and thief. Captain Sterling had died a titan of the community, his crimes buried under a mountain of money and influence. Adeline had the truth, a truth that could shame a dead man's legacy and stir up a hornet's nest in the valley. The question was, what would she do with it? Justice is not always a grand, public affair. Sometimes it is a small, quiet act, a debt paid in a forgotten place. Adeline had no desire to ride down into the valley and brandish the letters in the faces of Sterling's heirs. What would it accomplish? It would not bring Amos Weaver back. It would not restore his lost years. Vengeance was a fire that consumed the person who held it, and Adeline was tired of being consumed. She had had her fill of burning. Instead, she took another path. She made the walk to Gant's Folly, not to the trading post, but to the small, overgrown cemetery behind the abandoned church. It was a place of leaning, weathered headstones, the names on them slowly being erased by wind and rain. She found a clear spot under a gnarled pine tree. For the next week, she worked. She found a suitable piece of flat-topped granite in the creek bed and, with a hammer and a sharpened steel chisel she bought from the trader, she began to carve. It was slow, laborious work. Her hands, which had just begun to soften, were soon blistered and raw again. But she persisted. Chip by chip, she carved his name, Amos Weaver. Beneath it, she added his rank, and the years of his birth and presumed death, pieced together from the letters. When it was finished, she and Zebulon, who had appeared one afternoon as if summoned, used a system of levers and rollers to move the heavy stone into place. They dug a small hole at the base of the marker. Adeline took out the tarnished silver locket and the bronze medal. She held them in her palm for a moment, the last physical traces of a wronged man's life. Then she placed them in the hole and covered them with earth. It was a burial. Zebulon stood beside her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. No words were spoken. None were needed. She returned to the cave house as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the mountains. The air was cool and clean. Kaiser came to meet her, his tail wagging, and walked beside her up to the cabin. Inside, the fire was burning low. She added a log, then sat at the small table and opened her ledger. On a new page, under her list of expenses for flour and nails and coffee, she made a final entry for the chisel. Then she dipped her pencil and wrote, in a clear, steady hand, the count settled. The house was no longer a refuge or a place of exile. It was simply home. She and Kaiser sat on the stone step at the mouth of the cave, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the peaks, leaving a sky full of stars. The mountain was silent, holding its secrets, and she was silent with it, at peace in its vast, enduring quiet.